Well, good morning, everyone. I wanted to have a chance as we move into fiscal year 21 and 22 and your work plan is to provide some content, context. And that's to allow us to understand what are we doing in an administrative space, where we are now in our relationship with USAID in terms of finances, but then also in terms of timeframes. And really, I want to cover that in terms of our financial overview and our no-cost extension. Good. Also, for those people who are with me online, I'll be doing this. I am going to see if I can turn off my camera down here, only because I don't want that to serve as a distraction. All right, well, nope. My apologies for that. I should not have been so ambitious. And all right, well, let's talk about really a couple things. Well, I have got great news. And the good news is that USAID has fully obligated the funds for our project. And the reason it's such great news is in our signing document, we had $11 million or $1.2 million committed by USAID. And because of that, CRS committed 10% of that. And that is the $1.2 million that CRS is bringing to us. What does that mean for us? Now, let me already explain this. We have a signed commitment with USAID. With that signed commitment, that is a commitment. Now, it's a commitment in the sense that they said, we're going to give you $1.2 million, or we would like to at least. And then what happens is, on average, maybe in a year, 2 to 3 times a year, they kind of, if you will, write us a check. They write us a check, says, well, of that $1 million, we are now going to obligate or give you or allow you to spend $1 million, $2 million, whatever that may be. So it does mean that can slow down sometimes if we don't get our kind of obligation in time. That may mean we need to slow down our funding, or we may get an obligation, but at the end of a fiscal year, so it may force us to spend or possibly show an under expenditure against that obligation. So this is great news. The other thing is that we know that LRO has been prioritized by USAID in Ethiopia, and therefore is more protected. What I mean by this is that USAID has to figure out how they're going to commit themselves or obligate for these funds. And they have said that one of the priorities, and they've shown it, that one of their priorities is to obligate the full amount to us. What it means is that we don't really need to plan for a possibility of having a shortfall of them. They could have said, yes, we have a commitment of 11.2 million, but sorry, we can only really obligate $10 million, and we could have faced a $1 million shortfall. That would have really probably forced us to really reconsider the size and scope of the project. So we're happy about that. Now, we have always kind of projected ourselves, especially early on in the project, to kind of over expense, and then we kind of reel that back, bring back those anticipation. We reduce our expenditures as we go on. We are at this point, quote, scheduled to overspend the grant. Some of that has been very intentional. There's been other ones that have just been more problematic. Some of these examples would have been we of course we understood that we were going to be incurring greater costs with our partner hiring up. But now that we've had COVID-19, we may have had some idle staff or staff that have been underutilized. So we haven't been able to really necessarily take advantage of it. There was times in which we had, especially early on in the project, some very broad in scope assessments that were quite quite expensive at times. We've also decided to do the cash transfer program. So those are all things that have done it. What it means is that we need to remain conscious of that, but I also want us to recognize what are key programmatic choices that we need to make, but then also what are some of the operation costs around that. And we'll be having that. So what are we going to do next? When we go through this process, prior to the submission on August 31st, and especially afterwards, we are going to need to kind of come back and look at what are some of the fundamental changes that we need to make in terms of our budgeting. Now, what we do know is that at this point, of course, with the state of emergency, there is greater limitations to tie up contracts. And so we do need to see probably less about how are we going to manage this in terms of the staff reduced size, especially on the MCS side, as much as making sure we're really fully utilizing the MCS staff in the tests and the field staff as they move forward. And the second thing I want to talk to you about is a no-cost extension. And you're going to hear this, but this is probably one of the more bizarre examples of how to manage a grant. And I say this is because really this is one of the few cases where I can say international politics and the geopolitical conversations that are happening around the world have directly affected our projects. So as you may have seen over the news, especially in the last 6 to 8 months, there has been growing tensions with the United States, especially in terms of China, around Chinese manufactured communication systems. Huawei is an example of that. There was a detention actually of a CEO or somebody quite senior on their board. There's been concerns about surveillance, other ones. So what they did is the US government put in place something called NDAA 889. And what this is it puts restrictions on some Chinese manufactured communication systems. So give you an example, how does this affect if we had products, let's say ComCare, we had if we had hardware that was relying on, let's say Huawei tablets, that could be problematic. The good thing is that piece of legislation really only comes in at times when three things happen: when there's a new award, when there's a time extension, and when there's increased funding. So what USAID has done is saying, look, we don't understand the full ramifications of this, especially as EthioTel relies quite heavy on Chinese manufactured communication systems. So basically the suggestion was, let's at least buy ourselves time. Therefore, we're going to give a time extension, but they do not have the resources to make it a cost extension. They're giving a no cost extension. So again, think of this one, that they would like to give us, even though they're going to very likely waiting for the paperwork, so I can't say it has been done, but we now know it's a top priority, is that we know that they're granting a 6-month no-cost extension. So you can think of the end of September, I believe is what we submitted for. But it puts us also in another interesting space, which is, do we need to reserve some money for those last few months? Or will the project really finish as planned as January 2022? USAID is going to be asking a lot about our finance, a lot about our pipeline, about how are we managing advances to the partner, expenditures. They really want to make sure on how do we have enough money to get us at least to the end of January, possibly a little bit longer. I'm going to suggest that we may want to look at, in the event that we face some crises, we may need to approach other donors, maybe OFDA or even the Ethiopian Humanitarian Fund, to help offset some of those costs, such as what we've done under the cash and voucher assistance or other cash transfers, or if you will, kind of quote, an emergency response within the project, we just won't be having the same level of resources. In other words, unexpensed resources that we can allocate as easily as we did with the COVID-19. And the other one is, but it's also not very clear, is if and how this may have any effect on the actual proposal submission. Now, typically we would anticipate in end of Q1, say around December, USAID may release a call for proposals, and then kind of, that kind of Q2 and Q3, there's a lot of kind of writing and touch up. It can vary, but we just don't know how this concept of giving a no cost extension affects us. So again, I would say for all intentions and purposes, we're still looking at that January 2022. Not sure if we would get additional funding from USAID for that, but it's less to do with us as a project or less to do with us as a USAID Ethiopia funded project, as because USAID wants to reserve options as they understand this particular legislation. So I'm going to take a moment here. I'm going to stop this recording, and I'd like to open this up now for more kind of a